About 6 weeks ago, we started in the first chapter of the book of Genesis and have been looking at a series of lessons ever since then, which leads us up today to Genesis chapter 6. And as you're turning over there in your Bibles, I just kind of want to offer a summary of what we have studied thus far in the book of Genesis, kind of a direction that the narrative of the book of Genesis has taken us. If you remember in chapter 4, we see the birth and the growth and the development of an ungodly line of people through the descendants of Cain. The end of that chapter and into chapter 5, what we studied last week, we see the descendants of Adam through Seth. And this gives us hope because now not only is there an ungodly line of people or descendants of Adam in existence here upon this earth, but now there is a godly line also. And those two developing societies, you have this godly line who is seeking after and worshiping and serving God. And then you have this ungodly line who is rebelling and neglecting and living their lives in unrighteousness and sin. Now, the next step in man's progression, or I don't know if we should call it progression, more like regression, is how the ungodly line begins to pull the godly line down and away from God. And that's really what Genesis chapter 6 is all about. You know, when you read Genesis chapter 6, what we find out is this line, this godly line of people eventually is pulled down so far and influenced so much by the ungodly line, they become so corrupt that God has no alternative but to destroy the entire earth, all the human race. And this morning I want for us to think about, I know a lot of times when we study the flood, we study it in different ways and from different perspectives. But I want for us to think about the question, why did God destroy the earth? And that's really what I want for us to concentrate on in the first part here of Genesis chapter 6. And we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 7. As we go through this, what I'd like for us to get from this are three things that I want for us to point out as to reasons why God decided to destroy the earth. The first thing that I want to submit to you is the idea that that godly line began to ignore what was really important. And you see that development in the first part of this chapter. If you look at verse 1, the Bible records, "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair. And they took them wives of all which they chose." I want to stop for just a moment. I almost didn't even put this point in here this morning, but I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the identity of the sons of God. Because there's basically two different ideas that are usually presented to us from this particular passage. One idea is that these sons of God were angelic beings, spiritual beings that came down to earth and were living in human bodies, and they intermarried with man, with physical people in this world, and then the offspring that was born to them became very evil and corrupted the earth. The second idea is that these sons of God are just simply followers of God, that they're fleshly individuals. And I always tell you guys, whenever I present an idea, I emphasize this is my take, this is my opinion. I don't think it's without proof. You know, usually when people say about your opinion, well, do you believe that? Well, of course I believe it. If I didn't believe it, I wouldn't teach it, right? But in my opinion, and this is what you get because I'm teaching, these sons of God are none other than followers of God. They're fleshly men. They're descendants of the line of Seth. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about the two possibilities. And I don't apologize because I'm going to strongly emphasize what I believe and what my opinion is. And that is that these sons of God were just fleshly men. They weren't angelic beings in any way. But these are some of the arguments that are usually presented for them being angelic beings. First of all, the term sons of God is used in the Bible sometimes of angelic beings. In fact, I think I looked for some of them. Now understand this, there's over 5,000 references in the Old Testament. I didn't take time to go through all 5,000. I did look through a lot of them, and I did skim over most of them. And the the only references that I could find where this term is used to angelic beings is in the book of Job. And I think there's one time for sure in the book of Job that it's used there, possibly up to 3 times. But understand this, 5,000 times throughout the Bible, 3 times that it refers to angelic beings. So it indicates to you the majority of the time it's referring to fleshly beings. The second idea is found in verse 4 of Genesis chapter 6. We read about how these sons of God saw the daughters of men. They took them wives of all which they chose. And the result of that in verse 4 was that there were giants in the earth in those days. And also after them, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, they bare children to them. The same became mighty men, which were men of old, men of renown. Now that term giants, it's an interesting term in the Hebrew language. It's the word Nephilim. And it's not the only time that it occurs right here. It actually occurs 3 times in the Bible. Twice it occurs in the book of Numbers. I think in Numbers 13, if my memory is correct, or somewhere along those lines. My question is this, and this is the general argument that's usually used of it. The offspring of angels and these humans resulted in these genetic mutations. Okay, you kind of have these half angels, half humans, and the result of that were giant offspring. You know, these people who grew immensely tall. Well, if that was the reason why these people were giants, my question is, in Numbers 13, why are the giants there? You know, did this happen again in the history of man? Did it take angelic beings and human beings mixing in order to produce this offspring? And if so, at what point in history? Because we know from Noah, behind all those people were destroyed. At what part of history do they come back to this earth and do they reproduce with humans again? And then you have birth to these Nephilims or these giants. So it's an interesting question or idea, but that's kind of the general presumption. Sometimes people say, well, you have all this, this ancient Greek mythology that talks about these half gods, half men. It has to be relating back to this story. Well, it is true that ancient Greek mythology does have the idea of half men and half gods, but there's a lot of things in ancient Greek mythology that aren't in accordance with the Bible. The third thing that's often pointed out is, you look through the Bible and there are times when angels appear in human or bodily form. And that's true, isn't it? As you look back through the Bible, there are certain occasions, like in Genesis chapter 19, where you have the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where angels occupy a human body and come down to this earth. And I don't deny that from time to time, and that's what I want to emphasize, from time to time, angels did appear in humanly form upon this earth. But show me the instance of where an angel ever lived out his life here upon this earth. Show me an instance of where he ever entered into the body at the time of birth, and he lived here upon this earth till he became a man, and then he married a woman, and then they had offspring. Well, you won't find a story like that in the Bible. Generally, when these angels appear in human form, it's very brief, it's for a specific purpose, and then they disappear from off of the scene. Some people will say, well, there's 3 passages in the New Testament that seem to refer to this idea. I'm not going to read them. I'll give them to you if you want to look them up and study them. 1 Peter 3, 18 through 20. 2 Peter 2 and verse 4. Jude verses 6 and 7. So you can look at those, and that's, again, some of the ideas that people get from reading these verses. The third argument that's often used in favor of them being angels is they say, well, the Jewish writers, the Jewish historical writers, definitely tell us that this is a reference to angels. That is Genesis 6 and the first part of that verse. They'll quote people like Philo and Josephus and even the author of the book of 1 Enoch. And I just point out, Philo and Josephus aren't the authority. They say a lot of things, again, that we don't take for gospel within the church and the Bible. They say a lot of things that aren't in accordance with the Bible. So, again, those are just some of the arguments that are made. Why do I think that these people are fleshly people? Well, I'll give you a couple of reasons why I think this is the case. First of all, the entire context and contrast up to this point has been between these 2 godly lines. And so the storyline for us has been this, and that's the way that I think you have to understand it. Look at it in contrast. Look at it in context. What has the Bible been telling us so far? it's been telling us that there's this ungodly line that has been developing here upon this earth. It also has been telling us that there is this godly line that has been developing here upon this earth. And so you have, the storyline is you have two streams of the human race on opposite ends of the spectrums. One group is following God and worshiping God and serving God. The other group is defying God and living in rebellion and sin and unrighteousness. You can read about that in Genesis 4:26, 5:25 we talked about, or 5:22 we talked about last week. Enoch. It's again a description of the development of those lines. The term sons of God, I mentioned it's over 5,000 times in the Old Testament. There are definitely places where it does refer to just fleshly followers of God. You can find it in different books. You can find it in the book of Deuteronomy. You can find it in the book of Psalms. You can find it in the book of Hosea. And so there's definitely proof that this term can just simply mean a fleshly follower of God. Also, if you look at the context, notice the emphasis that's used in Genesis chapter 6, that God is dealing with men, not with angels. There's 4 verses to me that really stand and out and emphasize that idea. In verse 3 of Genesis chapter 6, God says, "My spirit shall not always strive with man." Now wait a minute, were these men or were these half men and half angels? Or were there angelic beings that God's Spirit was also striving with that were simply living in human bodies here upon this earth? God said He was striving with men, with fleshly beings. In verse 5, it says, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. Was it the wickedness of angels? Was it the wickedness of half angels and half men? No, it was the wickedness of men. In verse 6, it repented the Lord that He had made man on the earth. Who did God make? Did He make angels on the earth or did He make men? Well, again, verse 7, the Lord said, I will destroy man. Every verse that you read about here deals with man. It doesn't deal with an angel. It doesn't deal with a half man and a half angel. It deals with fleshly beings. And so the context indicates to me that these were indeed men. You also have the words of Jesus. And to me, this is probably the most powerful proof that you could offer. The words of Jesus in Matthew 22 and verse 30. Because what Jesus told us, well, not us personally, but a group of people in His day and age, is that angels don't marry. In fact, remember He made that statement there. He said, for in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. What did Jesus teach us about angels? They don't marry. What happened to these sons of God in Genesis 6 and verse 2? They took them wives. What's that? Marriage. They took them wives of all which they chose. What we learn about Jesus' statement in Matthew 22 is that angels are not sexual beings. They don't have intimate relationships with one another, and they certainly don't have intimate relationships with humans. And so to me, all the evidence indicates that what we're talking about here, the identity of these sons of God, is not some half God and or half angel or half human being. It's just simply fleshly beings that have come from the line of Seth. Now, is that important? Well, in a sense it is, because if that's my belief, what I'm going to tell you about the rest of this chapter fits in harmony with that belief that I just pointed out. So you have the identity here of these sons of God. And then what do you have? In verse 2, you have the intermingling of these sons of God with the ungodly line. In verse 1, in fact, we read there, it says, and it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them. So you have this idea, the human race is multiplying, and I want to emphasize that word. You know, it's not like a child or a person is coming to existence here and there, multiplying. What idea comes into your eyes? Well, great increase, tremendous numbers that are coming into existence. And we know this, generally it's the case, well, I think almost always it's the case when you look at in the Bible, except maybe from the beginning, that the ungodly people outnumber the godly people. Would you say that's a fair assessment? I mean, when we look at the world today, would the ungodly people outnumber the godly people? Yes. And so what happens if the human race is multiplying? Well, the ungodly are growing
in numbers more rapidly than the godly would. And that's kind of what you have here. Sin and righteousness is multiplying faster than good and obeying God. And so that's basically the picture that I have here in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1. The result of that is what? More ungodly women than godly ones. And so you have this idea, this development in the human race in verse 2, where the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. What happened? Well, these godly line, this people who are worshiping and serving God, they start to ignore some very important factors. And they start looking on the physical appearance of these women, and they start saying, these women are beautiful. And we've got to have them. You know, we've got to make them our wives. We've got to intermarry with them. And so they became infatuated with their physical appearance. I don't know if it was the case, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, if there weren't enough good-looking godly women to go around or not. I do know this. Their emphasis was put in the wrong place. What they were emphasizing was physical beauty. What they were not seeing was the real person, the person that matters most, the inward being. And so they were all focused upon this outward appearance of how beautiful these women had to be. What happened? They intermarried. They took wives of all these women that they chose. And what you have is you have the development of this godly line losing its distinctiveness, losing the identity that it had established. And so we understand this principle, and I've made this statement before, but I believe it to be true. It's the principle of consequence. You can't ignore the important things, and you can't ignore laws that are put into effect and have impunity. In other words, you can't ignore it and get a free pass, no consequences, no punishment. Now, it is kind of interesting to notice, and I'll just bring this up and let you kind of study it out for yourself a little bit. But was it the case that God had a law in effect where believers were not to mix or marry with unbelievers? Well, it doesn't say for sure in the patriarchal age. We know in the Mosaical age that law existed, don't we? But it is interesting when you read about men like Abraham and Isaac, you know what they were concerned about when it came to the marriage of their sons? Don't intermingle with worldly people. Don't mix with these other nations. So I don't know if this is a law at this time or not. I just want to point out a lot of the patriarchs that were following God were concerned with that idea of their children intermingling with the world or mixing in with the world. But it is interesting to point out, even if that's not the case, you can't ignore, even the wisdom of God when it comes to that subject and expect to escape without consequence. In other words, God put some laws into effect, and if you ignore those laws, there are consequences that come with that. We understand that in the natural world. One of the laws that God has put into effect is the law of gravity. Well, can I pretend like the law of gravity doesn't exist? I'm going to go out here and jump off a cliff and nothing's going to happen to me? No, if I ignore those laws, there are consequences that come along with it. And so it is kind of interesting to point out, that's same with true spiritually speaking too, isn't it? When God puts laws into effect spiritually speaking, you can't just ignore those laws and say, well, nothing's going to happen. We're going to escape without any consequences. But these sons of God did intermarry and mingle with the sons of men. So the first reason that we learn about here is these godly people, they begin to lose their identity because they ignored what was the most important thing. The second thing that I want to point out to you, the result of that is that the family or the home, the marriages that were formed and the children that were born into this, it made the home incomplete. And there are a couple of things that come to mind when I think about what would have been the result of these intermarriages. Well, first of all, you're going to have children that are being raised in an inconsistent environment. The Bible points out to us in verse 4, these sons of God came into the daughters of the men, and they bare children to them. And I think all of us understand that children, of course, are the next generation. They're the future of the church. They're the future of of God's people here upon this earth. They're going to be the next leaders that come into existence. And so they're very important fixtures within the history and the society, the pillars of society of the human race. So you think about it from that perspective, and you think, well, what do children need whenever they're being raised within a family environment? And one of the things that the Bible teaches us is they need stability. Okay? They need consistent instruction and direction within their life. And so if you have a godly person who's married these ungodly descendants of Cain, do you think consistent spiritual teaching took place within the home? I mean, there's no indication that these people, these descendants of Cain, changed in any way. What the sons of God saw is they were just good looking. And so we're going to marry them. We're not going to worry about what they believe and what they think and what effect that's going to have on our children. We just know that we want these women to be our wives. And so that's what they chose to do. Well, if you have one parent who is telling a child, this is the way, the direction that you need to go, and then you have another parent, they're saying, no, you can go in this direction, and it's really a better way. The choice is up to you. You know what they have? They have no stability. And you cannot expect, I don't care who you are, you cannot expect a child to be faced with the seriousness of that decision alone and go at it in the right way. Would you agree with that statement? I mean, generally a child is going to say, I'm going to do whatever benefits me the most. And that's the direction I'm going to pursue and how I'm going to go. So what did you have within the home? Well, you had this idea of one parent pulling the child in this direction, another parent pulling the child in the opposite direction. You know, the Bible talks about in 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 14 through 16, the incompatibility of a Christian and a non-Christian. And there Paul simply wrote this. He said, be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. He said, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? What communion hath light with darkness? What concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? And he says this, the Christian, he says, you are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. I'm always really careful when I come to or try to be careful when I come to this subject in the New Testament, because I point out, I don't think there's a law in the New Testament where it says it's a sin for a Christian to marry a non-Christian. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul talks to Christians who are married to non-Christian spouses, and he says, stay in that marriage. You know, it's legitimate. Don't depart out of it. But I also am very careful to emphasize this. At the very least, the Bible questions the wisdom of such a decision. Because you're basically trying to take two people who have different philosophies and different views, spiritually speaking, and infuse them together. How's that going to work out? Well, Paul put it this way. He said, what do righteousness and unrighteousness have in common? Can you find any common ground there? Is there any way you can fuse them together? He says, what do light and darkness have in common? Can you look at them and say, well, they can unite on this common ground, or are they just complete polar opposites? And that's one of the dangers that we get into as Christians. If we start entering into this realm where all of those who surround us are simply ungodly people, then there's a great chance that we're going to be influenced in the wrong direction. Now again, that's not to say that the New Testament forbids that kind of marriage. It does, I think, at the very least, question the wisdom of it. One of the questions I think that's never asked when it comes to that idea is, what effect is this going to have upon my children? And that's really a question you can't answer. You know, I wish we could all see into the future and say, well, our children are going to turn out fine if this is the decision that we make. The reality of it is we don't know. We can't see that far into the future. We can't make that decision. I can tell you what happened in Noah's days, though, can't you? I can read about it here in Genesis chapter 6. I can also tell you, too, that there were some people like Timothy's mother, who was in a mixed marriage, who influenced her child in a very positive direction. It's not cut and dry, but I always say this. When we talk about this idea, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle. I can tell you that for sure. And it's the souls of your children that are on the line. What are the souls of your children worth? You know, are you willing to gamble on that? Are you willing to bet, well, maybe they'll turn out, maybe everything will be okay? Or, you know, what would be the best decision or the most wise decision for us to make in those cases? What happened to these children? They were raised in an inconsistent environment. Did that have an effect on them? Absolutely. It pulled them in a line that this godly race was not willing to go down before. I also want to point out that the environment, and specifically also the home, became a place where the physical was idolized. And notice in verse 5, or verse 4, we read about that. It says there were giants in the earth in those days. Have you ever wondered why the Bible even tells us that? I didn't even talk about these tall men in the earth in these days. When the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bare children to them, the verse says, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. I think what the Bible is telling to us is, you have this picture of the earth in Noah's day. And it's a picture of lawlessness. And it became a place where violence dominated everyday activity. Do you know who wins those battles, usually speaking? It's the physically dominant, isn't it? There were people in those days who were giants. There were people in those days who were physically dominated. They lived in a world that was ruled by the strong and the dominated. And that was simply the state of Noah's world, as we read about there in Genesis chapter 6. Now, what did the people of the world think about these giants? Well, they were the famous people of the earth. They were the ones that they looked up to. They were the ones that they idolized. They were the ones who were the most well-known. And you think about, what does that mean? That means that the world was putting all this emphasis on the physical. Is our world any different today? I mean, you think about what dominates the thinking and the lives of most people today. Isn't it the physical? And you look at all the things that occur, isn't it just about the flesh of man? That's what we're concentrated on. That's what we're emphasizing. That's what we're idolizing. That's what we're exalting. And I'm talking about the world in general, not Christians per se. I was amazed whenever I watched the Super Bowl. And I don't generally, when I watch TV, I don't generally watch commercials. If I'm going to watch a sporting event, I'll record it beforehand because I don't want to waste time watching commercials. It stretches it out too long. I made an exception in the case of the Super Bowl. And it was amazing to me. I was watching all these commercials, which weren't very good, in fact. But I was watching all these commercials, and it was amazing to me how sexual they were in nature. Now, I don't mean just plain out pictures, but I mean you have all these undertones and all these euphemisms that involve some idea revolving around sexuality. You look at children's movies today, these animated movies. It's amazing to me how many sexual innuendos are within those movies themselves. What does that tell me? It tells me that that's what's controlling the lives and the thinking of the world that we live in. It's the flesh. It's the physical. And that's how it was in the days of Noah. They saw these giant men and they say, wow, these are great men. These are powerful men. These are the men that we want to be our leaders. These are the people that we're going to listen to and do whatever they tell us to do. Well, again, you think about us as humans today, it's the physical that we emphasize so much. It's people with money or wealth or, the positions or power that they have. That's what controls the thinking and the lives of most people. The first society, that's the way that it was. You read about in the book of James, in James chapter 2 and verses 6 through 7. Did it change in the days of Jesus? No. Remember what James wrote there? He said to the early church, he said, you have despised the poor. Do not rich men oppress you and draw you before the judgment seats? Do not they blaspheme that worthy name by which you are called? Who did the early church, who did they want coming into their assemblies? They wanted the rich. They wanted the powerful. They wanted the people in positions of political positions coming within the church. What did they think about those people who didn't have and occupy those positions? The poor. They're nothing. Sit here at my feet. Oh, you got money? Sit here by me in the pew. That's generally the way that mankind thinks. And so today, who is it that men idolize? It's the beautiful. It's the wealthy. It's the people in powerful position. It's the people who are tremendously blessed, athletically speaking. Those are the people that are exalted within our society. And you know what generally rings a bell when you look at the lifestyle of these people? They are some of the most immoral people that live here upon this earth. Now, not all of them are, but generally speaking, that is the case. And even like in the first century church, there's still some Christians today. Those are the people that they idolize. Those are the people that they look up to. Those are the people who are most well known to them. Well, that was the state of the world and the state of the home. The physical was all that was being emphasized. And so naturally, these giant men would have been mighty men, obtained very powerful positions within the world in which they lived. The third thing that I want to point out to you is the wickedness of man increased. In verse 5, it said, "And God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." What does that mean? It means that wickedness multiplied. People committed more and more sin. Society wasn't getting better. There weren't improvements that were being made that led people toward the direction of following God and obeying His commandments. Every day they were becoming more and more lawless and more crime-ridden. And so criminal activity and disobedience to God was increasing, not decreasing. That's scary to me, isn't it? Because when I say that, I think about our own society. When you look back on our society the last 100 years, would you say that we're trending toward God or we're trending away from God? You know why God destroyed the earth in the days of Noah? It's because people were trending away from God. Every day, every year, every decade, every century, it was becoming more and more sin-filled and more crime-ridden. In fact, we read there in verse 5 that the wickedness of man was immense. The King James Version says it was great. Great doesn't just mean that sin multiplied. I think it means that it became more and more extreme, more vile, more perverse, more destructive, more devilish, more obscene, more gross, more heinous. I think about crime today and think about the degradation of the human race. And it's amazing to me that people come up with all these new ideas. They carry depravity and they carry doing things wrong to the most extreme. And one of the examples that came to my mind when I was thinking about this is, it's not enough for people to just go out here and steal today. You read about or you look at on the news some of these natural disasters that occur. You come in, or hurricanes come in, they destroy these businesses. You know what people do? They go loot the businesses. Man, that's humane, isn't it? That's good people, isn't it? Here you are, you're in a tremendous disadvantage. This natural disaster has caused this catastrophe. Let me hurt you some more. Let me take advantage of you in this difficult situation. You think about people, their stories today. I watch a lot of crime shows, but there's stories today. People who have car trouble end up getting kidnapped. They're at this disadvantage, and what do people see whenever they see them? Well, not somebody they need to help, but somebody I can hurt, somebody I can take advantage of. And the persistence of that and the degree of that just gets more and more debased. The longer human society goes on. That was the state of Noah, the state of Noah's world that he lived in. Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 9, it talks about Sodom there. It said about Sodom that they declare their sin. They don't hide it, they declare it. I've made mention before, it wasn't just that Sodom sinned, it was how they felt and how they portrayed their sins to other people. They were proud of it. They were proud about how vile and how disgusting and how debased it had become, and they paraded around in the faces of everybody around them. Sound familiar today? Scary, isn't it? The wickedness of man was immense in the earth. And the last thing that I'll mention is the imagination of man ran wild. God saw in verse 5 that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It was only evil. It was only corrupt. It was only contaminated. It was only opposed to God. Man's mind was flooded with all these thoughts and imaginations, and they were selfish in nature. And they were things that involved covetousness and greed and bitterness and hatred and violence and destruction and sexual immorality. It was this unending flow of thoughts and imaginations that flashed through and occupied the minds of the earth every second of every day. That's all they were thinking about. Jesus taught us about the importance of controlling our minds and our thoughts in Luke chapter 6 and verse 45 when he made this statement. He said, "A good man out of the good treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is evil. For of the abundance of his heart his mouth speaketh." Jesus taught us there that what occupies our hearts and our minds is going to be reflected in the way that we speak. It's going to come out in the words that we use. And I'll also go a step further. It's going to come out in our actions too. It's going to show, our actions are going to show what's really going on inside of our minds. If our heart is set on good things, Jesus said you're going to be doing good things. The opposite is true too. If our heart is set on evil things, we're going to be doing evil things. We have to make sure that our minds and our hearts are focused on good things and good thoughts. And it was the heart of man that was the problem. That was what gave birth to all the wicked and the sinful actions that took place in the days of Noah. It was this wicked thinking, this sinful mindset that people had. All they could think about was their fleshly desires. All they could think about was how are they going to satisfy those. All they could think about were possessions and positions within the world in which they lived. And so they were given over to evil thinking continually. How did the world end in the days of Noah? Well, it began with the decline of the godly people, the godly race. Godly people started focusing on, they started concentrating upon physical things. They started putting the spiritual things, the most important things, second. And you know what that led to? It led to the decline of the home, didn't it? It led to the decline of the next generation. And it just kept snowballing and snowballing until you have this result where the entire human race is wicked in their thinking, and it's just increasing day after day after day. When I think about the question, why did God destroy the earth in the days of Noah? You know, generally what I say is, it was the ungodly's fault. You know, it's all these ungodly people. And there's a sense in which that is true. I understand that. But also, if you study the account, you know what the turning point was? It was the godly people turning ungodly. It was the followers of God not emphasizing what was most important in this life, dwelling upon the physical, leading to the decline of the home, leading to the decline of the human race. I think the message for us today is, let's be sure we're not following in their footsteps. Let's be sure that as godly people today, we're not pursuing that same course that people pursued in the days of Noah, where we start to overemphasize the physical. That becomes what's most important and dominates our thinking. And we leave the most important things, the spiritual things, out of our decisions in life, because it's not going to be good for our home, and it's certainly not going to be good for the entire human race. Maybe there's one here this morning who's not yet a child of God.